It's such a pleasure speaking at this educational forum for GBL. Thank you for inviting me. I feel privileged to speak on this subject because I think it's very dear to our hearts, and given the gravity of what's happening, it's important that we begin to take stock of what is currently the situation with the far right and what it represents for us in the future. So how do we read the summer violent racist riots? What do they tell us about the strength and reach of the far right groups in the UK? Do they represent a new phase in far right and extreme right organizing, posing even a bigger threat for us in the future? But we all know that the right-wing groups deliberately exploited the appalling mass stabbings in Southport on 29th of July, and in which 3 young children were killed by falsely claiming that the perpetrator was a Muslim asylum seeker. And a day later, far-right demonstrators attacked a local mosque in Southport, yards away from the scene where the killing took place. And over the following days, the unrest spread to other towns and cities in England, as well as Belfast in Northern Ireland. 31st July saw riots in London where 100 people were arrested. And riots also occurred in Manchester, Hartlepool, and Aldershot. On 2nd of August, a Citizen Advice Bureau office was set up, was arson attacked in Sunderland. The most severe rioting took place over the weekend of 3rd and 4th of August, when far-right protesters attacked homes of individual so-called BME people, migrants, housing asylum seekers. The disorder, including racial attacks, arson and looting, attacks and sieging of mosques, as well as knife attacks on individuals. And this has been termed as the largest incident violent rioting in England since 2011. The first point I want to make is that although limited in formal organizing, this is the first occasion in post-war Britain that the far-right groups were able to orchestrate and coordinate violent protests targeting spaces, resources, and sites used by migrant and Muslim communities in 27 towns in England and Northern Ireland over a space of 5 days. This actually requires communication, it requires leaders, it requires foot soldiers, as well as a degree of significant local support. And if you draw on the other historical examples, the riots have threads of classical fascist mobilization. At the top are leading demagogues, the political provocateurs willing to exploit any issue for their political advantage, no matter what the consequences for the people or communities involved. Beneath them are hardline foot soldiers. And at this moment, their size is contested from anything from 3,000 to 20,000, who've been involved in fascist groups over the last decades and decades. And they're the true believing fascist muscle behind the riots. They include supporters of the English Defence League, which is now defunct, including the former leader, Tommy Robinson, members of the neo-Nazi hate group Patriotic Alternative, the neo-Nazi organization British Movement, the far-right political party National Front, National Action, which is a proscribed organization, as well as the Britain First, Yorkshire Finest, and different residue groups organizing in localities. Then there is this significant large group of disgruntled, dispossessed, and disillusioned people who are so disconnected with their lives, with so little economic hope, with so little understanding of the real forces that drive our society, that they are prey to the simple message that someone else is to blame for how they feel, and they can be identified by their race, their color, or religion. The far right target these communities and treat them as, could be termed as combustible material that can be set alight. And when the fire is lit, there are always new joiners who can't resist the excitement, and many participate in violent behavior. Now, since Brexit and beyond, the monitoring group has worked in these areas from Hartlepool to Hull to Mexborough to Tamworth, which saw some of the most violent, Rotherham, which saw some of the most violent racist attacks. And our experience from talking to them from Brexit onwards has been twofold. The first is there's a total lack of engagement from mainstream political parties, trade unions, or the left progressive sections, including far left groups who've never in these areas. But they do have some kind of relationship with younger group of either ex-UKIP supporters or reform supporters. And the second thing is that they are so disconnected, they home into alternative social media to get their messages. And that includes social medias on Telegram, etc., etc. And the largest issue for them is the issue of immigration. And they have preconceived notions on both the size and the impact of an immigration on their communities. I'll come to that in a minute. And Guardian has done actually data on the current riots using court filings of about 500 cases. They've tracked them of alleged rioters and cross-referenced their personal details with other publicly available data. And it's interesting, before we look at the data in more specific terms, uh, to see how many of the men and women who were prosecuted are actually breaking down in the dock when they realize the consequences of their actions during the riots. In fact, many of them are older, not very young people without any past convictions. The sense of anger whipped up by the demagogues, some mainstream politicians, and of course, for years, by sections of the right-wing media have left them bewildered, facing jail and future lives seemingly beyond repair. And I've spoken to some of those people over the last month. The first is this notion that, especially in areas like Southport, that actually were outsiders who came in and created the damage. And it's a view that was echoed by the Labour MP for Southport, Patrick Hurley, who told the BBC Radio 4 Today programme the next morning on the 30th of July that the unrest was, I quote, led by people from outside the town. It's a tempting conclusion, but actually it's totally false. The data gathered by The Guardian of no more than half of those charged shows that to be untrue. The majority of people charged in connection with the unrest were local to the disturbances in which they were accused of taking part. An analysis of the home addresses provided with those charged found that 3/4 lived in a 5-mile radius from the locality, and that's in every town. The second aspect of the data that is quite revealing is the deprivation, bad health, and out of work conditions of those people who are disgruntled. And if you just go beyond Oldham and you come to a neighborhood called Miles Platting, which is between Manchester and Oldham, a neighborhood with the highest rate of people charged from taking part in the riots. In that estate alone, 6 people from the estate have been prosecuted so far, and another 10 remain to be prosecuted. The area has levels of deprivation higher than the average for both England and Manchester. Close to 2/3 of households are considered deprived, substantially above the average. And as riots erupted in Southport on 30th of July, many protesters chanted the name of right-wing activist Tommy Robinson in that area. Well over half of those charged with offences, most commonly violent disorder, came from the most deprived 20% of the neighborhoods. But social deprivation is not the only commonality. Using census figures, The Guardian found that suspected rioters were also from more likely to live in areas with high levels of poor health. More than a third, 36%, come from the 10% of neighborhoods with the worst self-reporting health levels. More than a quarter, 29% of rioters, come from 10% of neighborhoods with the lowest levels of qualifications, areas that have the most residents with no qualifications, or level 1 certificate as the highest include Hendon and Docks, as well as Bolton upon Dean. The third aspect that we look at in the data is the impact of Brexit and Reform UK. And it's obvious to say this, the riots do not fall from thin air, but were fed by years of anti-migrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric and campaigning from far right, from mainstream politicians, as well as mainstream press. Its impact has led to the skewing of public perception on people seeking asylum and blurred perception from reality. On average, the census as well as other research shows that the public thinks that people seeking asylum represent more than a third of the total immigration. That's 37%, when in reality, it only accounts from 6 to 7%. And as the riots raged on, we know that Nigel Farage has been accused of amplifying false information. And if you look at the analysis of the address of rioters charged from those areas that tend to have higher levels of support for Farage's Reform UK, a third live in the 10 most reform voting constituencies in the country. In these constituencies that house 5 or more people charged, close to a quarter, that's over 22% of the electorate voted reform compared with 14% UK-wide. A third of those charged live in constituencies with the highest support from UK. Now, this riot has been compared to 2011 because it's of the type of disturbances that took place. And the Ministry of Justice figures analysis show that at least 5 to 6% of those involved in the 2011 riots were about middle-aged. Majority of the 2011 riots were young people. By comparison, 37% of those who took part in the far right riots are above 40. They're not young, and they're also local. The other disturbing new feature of this riot is not just the use of social media, the wide use of social media, including Telegram, chats affiliated with Active Club England, the Telegram network, and the football hooliganism firms. But socials were used extensively to amplify disinformation, but to also organize the disturbances. What is, however, radically different in 2024 in these riots is the existence of opinion forums and cult-like personalities from Musk to Tate to Robinson, who have systemically built large online followings around race, immigration, and division. I think last week I looked at the stuff that Robinson does. He's already galvanized 1 million followers in the last 7 to 8 weeks. So the situation has been exacerbated by mainstream politics. In standing up to the far right, it has consistently adopted its language and political positioning. It's interesting to read Gordon Brown's article, for example, in The Observer a couple of weeks ago, where he actually indicates and strongly says that it's the centrists that have accommodated the far right and hence their growth throughout Europe, especially in Germany and in Austria. So what does the challenge look like? What does the challenge to the far right require? What does it mean? And I think the challenge to the far right requires the unity of purpose across progressive people in our society. In my view, the current government can't hide its own pandering to the racist rhetoric on immigration and suspect communities. And on suspect communities like the Muslim communities, it's been a generation old, especially since 2001 onwards. Moreover, its policy of militarizing immigration, border command to stop the boats, and criminal gangs means it will be held hostage to the far-right demands in the future. For the first time since post-war, four elected far-right MPs will be able to amplify their voice in UK Parliament, use it as a national platform for its racist policies globally. And I'm not sure at the moment, and there is no indication that they will be challenged and exposed in Parliament, perhaps by a small group of people, but not by the majority of Labour members of Parliament in Parliament. The toxic combination of extreme right rioters on the streets with their foot soldiers, as well as social media, and the far-right MPs in Parliament with their social media amplification is a dress rehearsal for more turmoil in the future. In times like these, the government has a critical role to play, especially a Labour government. And so it is not just right that the justice system is used forcefully, it has to call out racism and fascism that feeds the fire. At the moment, there's no indication that they'll do that. These riots seem to have been suppressed, but unless we come up with new approaches to understanding what allow the fascists to get a grip on so many of our communities, then we'll be back here in many years to come. And in my view, doesn't require high political theory. It comes to some basic political nuance.
Suresh, just to let you know, you've got 5 more minutes maximum.
Yeah, 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll finish in 5 minutes. Thank you for reminding me. 14 years of austerity have produced 14 million of people in poverty, including 4 million children, a housing crisis, public service on the news, and a grotesque visible level of inequality, generating a sense of unfairness overall. The low turnout, a low percentage level of support for the incoming Labour government should have sounded a warning on just how disillusioned with the political establishment people are. People can't take another way of austerity. For a longer term, we need to get well-grounded progressive organizations across our society, like the trade union movement, the anti-racist campaigns, poverty campaigns, women's organizations, and many others that could be the foundation stones of such a movement to restore optimism to us all. We need real solidarity to those racialized communities that are directly facing far-right violence and also institutional as well as state racism. We also need to collectively focus on working class communities that feel hopeless about their lives and are engaging with far-right narrative. We need a movement that can organize in each of our communities to listen to the cares, concerns, and yes, the grievances people have, and to mobilize them and prepare them to implement the plans they have to create the communities they deserve and they want to live in. Thank you for listening to me.